we'd be backstage for like 3 hours and all of a sudden realizing that Guns N' Roses hasn't gone on the stage yet.
Welcome to the podcast, Appetite for Distortion, episode number 512. My name is Brando. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Stephen Blush. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing great. That's 512 episodes. So you said?
Yeah. Yeah,
Wow, that's incredible. That's really incredible. Respect to you for sure.
well, that means a lot coming from you with the amount of books that you've written and the documentaries that you've produced and how long you've been around the scene. So yeah, 512 is giving me a chance to interview people like you. You're from Jersey, but where are you right now? In
I'm in the
respect to
city. I live in Manhattan.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
I'm in Queens right
Yep.
now. I'm in Queens, Forest Hills. And I was
Hmm.
telling you off the air in the true spirit of New York City and things just not being finished and things falling apart. After I had, confirmed this interview again, my bathroom in my apartment, the ceiling started leaking. So there's the supers are in and out. So maybe we'll hear some fun background noise, but I think we'll be okay. I guess figured.
Okay. We could deal with it.
Yeah, well, I like to give my listeners a heads up because sometimes my son, a 2 year old's running around, but now
Yep.
he's out with my wife at dance class. So uh, enough about me. I wanted to learn about you. For those who are unfamiliar with your work and your publications, do you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, Stephen? You said also off the air since you became an author. You're
Yes.
Stephen. So tell us about
Yeah,
Steve.
my first book came out as Steven, so I've it's very interesting that people who knew me before that refer to me as Steve, but Steven is a professional name, so we could work with that. Um,
Tell us about Steve then, how we got to
yeah.
Stephen.
Well, let me see. Well, if you want my life story a little bit, I was a kid who was growing up in New Jersey, and I was always into punk rock from like the earliest times. I was on a high school exchange program to England. So I saw the Clash before they came to America, things
Wow.
like that. So I was really kind of ahead of the curve at all moments. So I went to college in Washington, D.C., and there was this new form of punk rock that was happening that really spoke to me, which was known as hardcore. The original punk was really great, but it was a lot of artists and like the British were talking about being on the dole or talking about Maggie Thatcher and the Queen and like just stuff that didn't really relate to. But here came
Hmm.
this new form that was a suburban form of punk. And in DC, it was bands like the Bad Brains and Minor Threat. And I was never a musician, so I found my place within the scene as the kid promoter.
Hmm.
So I promoted all these bands. I promoted Black Flag and Dead Kennedys and Circle Jerks and Suicidal and half these bands crashed on my couch. So it was a very really influential on my life as it went forward. And uh
Do you still have that couch?
definitely not. But the the end game was that I went to college probably to be a lawyer at the George Washington University, and I was never going to be a lawyer after that. So
Uh,
And I actually failed. I got an F in English when I was in my junior year of high school. And the
hmm.
teacher just, I would love to see that teacher when I would love to run into him. But so I didn't really think I was much of a writer. But I wrote for the alternative newspaper at my college and I got really good feedback. So this was kind of happening and I moved to New York and I started writing for some magazines, doing interviews. My first ever interview was Harley Flanagan from the Cro-Mags, um, which fit in with my past in Washington, D.C. And I became a writer for a lot of fashion magazines and rock magazines like Interview and Paper and Details, and of course, Spin Magazine and uh, the rock magazines, Rip Magazine.
Hmm.
So I really found my place as a writer, I started my own magazine called Seconds Magazine, which we did 50 issues of. It was kind of underground, never really made the leap, but I knew everybody in the music scene. I mean, you see some gold records behind me with Soundgarden, Faith No More, and those were the bands I was kind of helping to break at the time. Tool, this Typo Negative, those were the kind of bands that I was helping to break at the time. We were a so-called tastemaker magazine, and my writing for the other magazines kind of crossed over into that. And flash forward to the late 90s, I was seeing all these history of rock and roll documentaries on the air, and they would do things like it would go talk about the Clash and the band X maybe, and then it would go straight to Nirvana, like this whole hardcore thing never happened. And
Yeah.
it kind of inspired me to write my own book. I had promoted shows without ever promoting a show before. I started a magazine before ever having any experience in publishing. I became a writer without a journalism degree. So I wrote a book without any experience, and that was the original American Hardcore. And that took off out of the box. Um, and the the action with that was I felt like that there was it was before the internet was really big. So, and it wasn't like you called information and got the number from Joey Shithead from DOA. It didn't really work like that. It was just really the connections I had with everyone from my days in college. And I compare it to like the army, where you've been through it all with these people, and you could pick up like 20 years later and
You haven't missed a beat.
right, and you don't miss a beat exactly. So I wrote the book. um then I made the film with Paul Rackman, who was at the time doing really cool videos like Temple of the Dog, Hunger Strike, and Pantera Cemetery Gates, and Bad Brains Eye Against Eye. And so we were a good match, and we made the film American Hardcore, and it went to Sundance. And that was just such a trip. We really were like on, in the mainstream all of a sudden. And that inspired me to write a second edition of the book, which is the one that most people have. And that was basically because I had spoken to a lot of people, because it was before the internet, and I was speaking to a lot of people for their information. I felt a lot of people were just, they didn't remember things quite right, and I had to go to more, um, once I was able to do my research and I had already done the film, I really had this, new, like real kind of fire and experience. And that's led to that. And I've written 8 books since. And recently I just did a trilogy. Um, When Rock Met Disco, When Rock Met Reggae, and the new one coming out in November, which I'm promoting, is When Rock Met Hip Hop. And I'm not really talking about disco or reggae or hip hop. I'm talking about how it crossed with rock and roll. So
Hmm.
disco, I'm talking about when Kiss did I Was Made for Loving You, or the Rolling Stones did Miss You.
Hmm.
Here's where like really great musicians doing dance music. And
Right.
they took a lot of shit for it, but I don't think you could listen to those records now and have, think that there's anything really wrong with it. And
No, I agree. It's funny. Gene, of course, shits on that song.
yeah,
And that was the one he did with Desmond Child, right?
right,
And
exactly. That was
yeah,
their beginning with the Desmond Child whole thing.
because Desmond has been on the podcast and he just talks
Mm.
about Gene. He's like, yeah, I made him all that money, and like Gene loves that song. He's just trying to like distance himself because he's too cool for that.
Yeah, yeah,
It is funny, and then just kind of, well, I just can't get past of just that teacher. I really do hope you meet that teacher because even though you're not a musician, just like me, and I'm
Yep.
in a way a promoter doing radio, whatever, it's
Sure.
hardcore what you've done. It
Yeah.
is hard, to create this life for yourself and to not in the traditional way.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I got a journalism degree,
Hmm.
but so I went a more traditional route. But I
Hmm.
admire, you said you admire the amount of episodes I've done of this. I admire what you've done because it's you probably got like I get a lot of no's. I don't take no's well. You probably got even
Hmm.
more no's if you're not even doing it the proper way. Like, no, you can't do this, you can't do that.
Right.
And the fact that you're here was celebrating, so it's not lost, the 15th anniversary of your award-winning American hardcore film, and then it's the second edition. We haven't talked about this yet. American Hair Metal, that book,
Yep.
and as you
Yep.
mentioned, the trilogy when rock met hip hop, and it's all meets here on Appetite for Distortion. And why I was excited to talk to you today because you mentioned a few bands. If you can't tell, Guns
Hmm.
N' Roses is my
Yes.
theme.
Yep.
But you
I
meant
love the name of your podcast, by the way.
thank you.
Yeah.
Appetite for Distortion. You know who just said the same thing? Who's probably going to be a future guest? I'm just looking at making sure I actually believe it because I never believe when people agree to be on the podcast.
Yep.
Carrie Kasem, Casey's
Oh.
daughter, said
Yep.
he's like, I love the name of your podcast. I'm like, come on.
Yep.
It's fine. But you talk about, oh, here's one thing that was really interesting. Today, as we're recording this, you said your first interview was with Harley from
Yep.
my main job for radio for with Premiere is to do radio tours, like kind of what you're doing, but just more, succinct with different radio stations. Harley is
Mhm.
doing a radio tour today with us for his documentary.
Wow, that's great. I got to see the documentary, and
Wired for Chaos. That's just a
yeah.
very weird universe kind of, promoting hardcore,
Yep.
today on this day. Um, but you mentioned like Bad Brains. Slash is
Hmm.
a major fan of Bad Brains. He's worn shirts on stage.
Hmm.
Minor Threat, uh,
Hmm.
Black Flag. Henry Rollins has been on the show. He told us that he was like a roadie once for GNR at some UCLA show. So I would just love to know more about like these bands. What makes Minor Threat such a and Bad Brains like still after all these years like so impactful on like musicians that are, big musicians again like Slash, like Duff. They often cite these bands, these
Hmm.
hardcore bands. What makes them so powerful today, all these years later, when the media tried to ignore them, like you said, like it
Yeah.
didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, that's what it was there was never like a uh the record industry kind of ignored this music, and the music first of all was so radical. It was so like not part of the mainstream and so not part of the music industry. It wasn't like there was a signing frenzy of signing bands to be like the next Agnostic Front, right? So
Right.
it stayed true to itself and it stayed underground. And that's the power of hardcore. The power of hardcore is that everybody discovers it in their own terms, in their own place. The pioneers you're talking about, I think for any musical form, the pioneers are the ones who stand out, right?
Hmm.
So, the Bad Brains and Minor Threat in Washington, D.C., for instance, they were so intense. I mean, there was such fury, there was such um, what they lacked in musicality, they brought with angst and attitude and revolutionary furor. And you can't duplicate that. There was not like there were no uh, there was no barrage of videos by these bands. I mean, there was here and there, like I mentioned, the
Right.
Bad Brains video. There was a famous suicidal video, for institutionalized. But
Yeah.
you
Pepsi.
know,
All I wanted was a Pepsi.
yep, what a great song, right?
I
And
didn't he just finally collaborate with Pepsi to get his own drink? Didn't that finally just happen? Or am
oh,
I
I
dreaming
never
that?
heard that one.
All right,
That's great.
maybe it was a fever dream. Okay.
Yeah. No, it could very well be. I may have slept on that one. But I don't know, man. These bands still live today because of how hard they brought it. They were bringing it so hard, and it was when I hung out with Black Flag, they talked about success in non-economic terms,
Hmm.
which was an idea that really blew my mind. I never even considered that. The idea that you could be successful and yet not really making any money at what you're doing, right? So, I think I followed that path quite a
I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, I think I'm doing that right now.
and but you know what? I gotta say, when I was when I thought about what I wanted to do at age 18 to 25 is what I'm doing now, right? I'm still doing it,
Hmm.
and that's the power of music. It will You can't be afraid of making mistakes. You can't be afraid of following your dreams. Um, it's kind of hard to explain to some people. I talked to my daughter goes to a public school, and New York's very different than it used to be. And, everybody works in finance and, things like that. And they couldn't even consider not, doing something conservative and safe and ultimately, all about the money. But a lot of people are jealous. A lot of people I meet who are who I consider successful, they're jealous of what I get to do. Because at the end of the day, I'm excited to wake up every morning. I'm excited to start writing, I'm excited to talk to you. I mean,
Hmm.
this is the payback, so I don't take it lightly. I think what this is hardcore.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, well said. And I feel a lot of that as I'm kind of nodding and smiling because yeah, kind of definitely cut from the same cloth with that. There was something you mentioned. I got to start writing things down. There was something you mentioned I just thought was so funny. It'll come back to me. But to make because there's a lot to talk about, the
Hmm.
pivot to hair metal, right?
Yeah.
So obviously it's another. I guess the radio obviously paid attention to that. It's a different, completely different. Oh, I now I remember. See, I stalled enough.
Yeah.
Agnostic Front, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
My first like radio in college, like doing that was the show was called The Aggressive Edge, and that's
Hmm.
kind of you mentioned how you discover hardcore in your own way. That's
Yeah.
how I discovered even Agnostic Front and all
Hmm.
these hardcore bands was doing this college radio show from
Yeah.
11 p.m. to 1 a.m. every Thursday. When I really wasn't a hardcore guy, I was more into the heavy metal and Guns N' Roses, and obviously it got as hard as Pantera for me. But I learned a lot, from doing that more deeper into the catalogs of some of like Suicidal, where I just really do that one song, but going deeper into it. So just a new appreciation of it because now to make the pivot, and I was like a hair metal guy. I was like, I was weird. I love grunge, hair metal, and hardcore and all in
Hmm.
a blender of crap. Uh, so the kind of I wanted to start this by asking you a question with the guest I had on a few episodes ago. He had his book out, Guns N' Roses at 40, Martin Popoff,
Oh
come out
yeah.
recently.
Great writer, by the way. Yeah.
He is, but he had a controversial opinion, which he said for many years that he considers Appetite for Destruction to be an above average hair metal album. And he's like, it's a good album, but he just didn't think it changed the game. Is that when you talked about hair metal, do you view as Appetite or Guns N' Roses as hair metal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how
Okay.
yeah. I mean, they came out of the box that way. It's very interesting now,
Mm,
like Guns N' Roses or John Bon Jovi, they kind of go out of their way to say that they weren't, but that was the that was the industry at the time. That was the scene at the time. So, I saw Guns N' Roses in Hollywood, right as that album came out. And you can't tell me that crowd wasn't, Sunset Strip hair metal,
mm,
but I don't say that with any disregard. I mean, I would actually disagree that it's a above average record. I would say it's a classic record, I would say that Guns N' Roses was a classic band, is a classic band. And I think the fact that all they've been through with all the weird stuff that Axl Rose was pulling in the late 90s and early 00s, and
Hmm.
for them to come back with Duff running the band and uh, just kind of picking up where they left off in the early 90s is pretty incredible. I have a lot of respect for Duff, a lot of respect for Guns N' Roses. I mean, I think that's a great band. So anyway, when I was living in after I was in Washington D.C., I came to New York, and I became a DJ in a lot of the clubs, and that's how I supported myself as a writer. Basically, was that I was, you make good money as a club DJ, and so I would work at a lot of these clubs. There was a place called the Cat Club in New York, and that was every Wednesday night was the home of hair metal in New York. And I worked at the Limelight, which was also like the home of hair metal on Sunday nights. So I really got into it. And, I was also discovered, as opposed to hardcore, which was kind of like a sausage factory, as you would refer to it as. I started getting into meeting women, and I met some of the coolest, most beautiful, like rowdy, cool women that I ever met in my life in that scene. So
Sure.
I really have no regrets about it. I mean, and I saw all these bands. So I think so. I wrote American Hardcore, which is in its second public edition, like we talked about. And then I wrote American Hair Metal, which I think I disillusioned a lot of my friends when I did that originally, which is now in its second edition as well. That came out about 6 months ago, and
Okay.
in its second edition. So I would recommend people want to check that out. So what was interesting about that book was American Hardcore was really raw, and you would interview the people, and they'd speak from the heart, and it was all about that. So I tried the same formula with American Hair Metal at first. And I remember talking to Don Dokken or, Phil Lewis from LA Guns, and they were almost embarrassed by what they did,
Hmm.
and they couldn't really talk about it because they were worried about what the wife and kids might think, and it was kind of lame, I thought. So I just went back to all my old magazines, which I had stashes of, and paraphernalia, uh, merch and stuff that I had from back in the day, and I made a book out of that. And
Okay.
and the quotes and interviews, the quotes and the lyrics were unbelievable. The interviews, these guys were on like real head trips. They thought they were all gonna, live forever and be stars forever, and so it's a little tongue in cheek. It is tongue in cheek.
Well, that's what makes because it was recently the anniversary of the decline of Western civilization, part two,
Hmm.
and it's kind of the same thing of just like how that era, it's just like
Yeah,
it's gonna last forever,
yeah,
and it doesn't. And yeah, I was lucky enough to also have Phil and Don on the show, and
yeah,
and other people from that era, and yeah, they're family men now, but it was what it was. It's like you
yeah.
can't talk about it in the same way though. So yeah, it does make it more challenging to write a book, like an honest book about it without going back to the unfiltered stuff when they were just being themselves without
Right.
without worrying. Yeah, it's a totally different world now. So, was that as fun to write then? Because I imagine the
Yeah, it was a
hardcore book.
blast because I'd
Okay.
go back and look at, those glossy magazines with
Oh
all
yeah.
all the stuff and find Rip and Metal Edge and I can't remember
Circus.
Circus and yeah. So that's where I found all my research was just going back and reading those magazines, which was a hoot, you know.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I found, it's kind of an interesting piece because it's very sociological. Um, I have fan letters where people would draw pictures of the bands
Hmm.
and like their favorite, here's my picture of Nikki Sixx and here's what I have to say about it. So that was a really fun book to write. I think a few of those people are I would say it's 50-50 on that crowd. Some of them feel they were made fun of,
Hmm.
but I can't really argue with them because I I was having fun at their expense. I was. And I think that's the reason the book's in a second edition is because it sold really well. And as opposed to but it sold to a very select crowd. I would describe it as they sold it to secretaries.
Okay. Okay. All right. All right.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
Um, well, I've always looked at hair metal. I know people try to think of it as a derogatory term, but to me,
Yeah.
it just explains that era, and I love that music. And even Martin Popoff didn't mean it in a derogatory way. It's
Yeah.
just like you, and I really, and that's what we spoke about. And I've been doing this since the beginning of the podcast, as I
Hmm.
wear a shirt from, my first GNR concert in 2002. So I
Hmm.
have a different perspective, completely different perspective of what Guns N' Roses was, is. You were there, so yeah, you can't tell. Nobody could tell you that that crowd wasn't, that wasn't full of Aquanet, and
Yeah.
it's they were slightly different,
Yeah.
and and what I like how he put it was I feel they made everyone want to get better,
Yeah.
so I appreciate that. And there's something else that you mentioned before, because there's so much to talk about with you, um, which I found interesting. Did you feel it's Duff's band now?
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's
Duff, when he was a hardcore kid, in a band called the Farts with a Z at the end.
yeah, he did.
Um, and he didn't even graduate high school, and he went back, got his high school equivalency diploma, he got his college degree, and then got an MBA. And he uses that to he's the manager of the band, right? And he has the skills now to do it. So it's a really incredible story, really. Um, and I think he instills the discipline. Uh, there used to be this thing about Guns N' Roses that you didn't even know if they were going to show up for their concert.
Right.
I remember when Soundgarden was their opening band, who again I was pretty tight with, and we'd be backstage for like 3 hours and just bullshitting, and all of a sudden realizing that Guns N' Roses hasn't gone on the stage yet, and that will never happen again. With Duff running the
No.
show, that does not happen. They're a very professional band now, and
Yeah, he's been a good boy basically since AC/DC, but yeah, I'm
yeah,
sure that was a clause of this reunion. Like, bro, we're all
yeah,
like in their 60s. You can't do this now.
yeah,
And yeah, sometimes they're even early. So yeah, no, it is interesting. And not like I know firsthand, but it seems like it was Duff's call to change the drummer.
yeah,
That's a pretty big, power, move of just like who's kind of running the ship or who has a big say.
yeah.
So no,
I
that's
I
cool.
knew him from the clubs in New York. I'm spacing on his name now. What's the name of the drummer who just left? Who was there for
Oh,
20
Frank
years?
Ferrer.
Frank Ferrer, yeah. And Frank Ferrer used to be in a band with the guy. Oh, I'm so bad at this. The guy who's still in the band who kind of took
Richard
that,
Richard
Richard
Fortus.
Fortus, yes.
Yeah.
So those guys used to play in clubs in like together, so they were kind of a package,
I
but it
no,
was a
you're
really
you're
incredible move for them to be in Guns N' Roses. They those guys were great. Those guys were, I assume that the drummer, from what I understand, is some friend of. Duff's from somewhere in
Yeah.
Seattle or LA or something. Yeah.
Yeah, he's they played in Loaded for a couple years together and
Right.
also AWOL Nation. So yeah, he's a Duff guy and yeah, Richard and Frank being a New Yorker, I'm privy enough to actually have had them both on the show
Oh, great.
when they
Terrific.
both were, which is I don't know how I got away with that at the time because you can't talk to anybody in Guns N' Roses, whether they're Axl or not.
Yeah.
I don't think that can happen again. But Frank recently did a DJ set, just like you were talking about
Hmm.
in New York, and my wife and I were talking about going, but I didn't want to leave my son. And I'm
Yeah.
like, can I take Harrison? She's
Yeah.
like, it's not that kind of. It was like called Breakfast Bar or something like that
Okay.
and it would have been too crowded. I'm like, nah, I want to take him. So I know Frank will be doing. He's from here. He'll be doing a lot of stuff. So I hope to see him
Yeah.
around
When your
town.
kids are young, when your kids are young too, you can't really
I'm
do
too
much.
eager. I'm
Yeah.
so eager, Stephen. I don't know. You have kids, right? You have
Yeah. Yeah.
uh
I have a 13-year-old daughter. Yeah.
what was the first show that you took her to? Do you,
Almost Queen, who are, if
okay.
you know who they are, they're
I
probably,
have.
yeah, probably one
I
of the first, probably one of the biggest cover bands in the country. But and they played in the theater of about 1,500, 2,000, so
How old
and
was she at the time?
she was probably 11, 10, 11.
Oh, I'm really too anxious.
Yeah.
He's already seen. uh what was the name? It was like Abbey Road. It was a Beatles cover band.
Hmm.
Dave Matthews.
Yeah.
So he's already gotten a few under his belt. I want to take
Oh.
him if Guns N' Roses tours next year. I will
Hmm.
get him like three headphones and I'll sit in the way back. He's going with me. I can't wait until he's 10. He's got to
Hmm.
go.
Yeah, my
Uh
daughter's become a hell of a guitar player too. And
love
on
that.
Father's Day, she wrote me a letter and said, "Thank you for teaching me to hate ballads."
Well, you don't like ballads?
No, I don't like ballads.
Yeah, I guess you're a
I mean,
harbcore guy, so you hate
yeah,
November Rain
I could do
probably.
without it. I
Okay,
could do
that's
it.
fair. I'll
Yeah,
take that.
yeah,
To continue your trilogy here, Stephen, and
yeah,
I feel we could talk about so much in addition to music.
yeah. So in November, I have the third part of the trilogy. Is called "When Rock Met Hip Hop."
Right, and obviously that's the hip hop like I grew up with,
Yeah,
90s hip hop and those crossovers. Like
yeah,
you just don't any crossover now, there's too many. Nothing's
yeah,
gonna stick out like what Anthrax did or what
yeah,
Aerosmith did.
yeah.
So
So
talk
that's
to
what the
me.
book's about. It's about
Tell
bringing the
me.
noise. Anthrax, Public Enemy. It's about Walk This Way, Run DMC, Aerosmith. It's about the Beastie Boys with Kerry King from Slayer. It's about Biohazard and Onyx doing Slam. It's
Hmm.
about the Judgment Night soundtrack, and it kind of ends with the music of today, which is kind of your uh, some of it's a little bit older, but it's still the music of today, which is kind of your Corn, Limp Bizkit, uh,
Hmm.
System of a Down, Linkin Park kind of thing. So,
Okay.
so it kind of ends the circle. But there was a time where rock met hip hop was. I mean, I still think you could do rock. Rock met hip hop is so common at this point. It's
Right.
almost it's not really groundbreaking, but at that point, it was really groundbreaking. MTV did a thing of their biggest videos of all time, and the number one video was Walk This Way, right? So
Mm.
it's a powerful subject. I think it's my best book. It comes out in November. I'm going to be doing a lot of hype for that, but this is part of it, just kind of planting the seeds right now
Yeah.
and
Oh,
getting the
that
word out a little bit.
that is cool because that's the era I grew up in, and you're right that it was all over. Whenever VH1 did those countdowns, it
Yeah.
was always there. The Run DMC, Daryl McDaniel,
Yeah.
he's another lucky one that I've had on the show.
Yeah. He's a cool
Just
guy.
very, very cool guy. Just it was so I don't know what that even says about us, where that was so shocking to do, And now you just have these, like, look at like Machine Gun Kelly. You know, I'm
Yeah.
not personally a fan, but the fact that
Yeah.
he just does all these different genres and it just doesn't matter anymore. So
You
it
know, I
just
was reading that he was kind of a hardcore kid.
that's what you hear, a hardcore kid, and then so that's something that's interesting. Where do these people where it comes from? So I think that's where your books are so important when you
Hmm.
look at today's artists, where everything is so blended.
Hmm.
Where did they come from? Well, how
Yeah.
did we get to this point? So that's why books like yours, with the hardcore music, with hair metal, which is oh, what other than disco? What is such a short-lived genre that is just going to continue like that and just be beloved? I just feel like there aren't
Well,
many.
you know, every once in a while there's like music that there's like a new music that comes around and it changes everything. There's like, you know, there's famous stories of like Warrant walking into the Columbia Records and seeing Alice in Chains posters and just knowing that it was over, you know,
Yeah.
or people I can't remember who it was, but somebody walked into Geffen and saw the Guns N' Roses record and just no, it was Guns N' Roses walked in. Axl Rose walked in and saw the Nirvana posters and knew it was over, right? And they'd have to almost reinvent themselves to come back, right? You know, so it's a music has this thing about like every 10, 20 years there's something that changes everything. You know, like when the Beatles came out, all those kind of like Pat Boone and uh you know, those kind of crooners, you know, they're kind of like post El like Elvis Presley came out and he knocked the Frank Sinatras out of the box. And
Okay.
then Beatles come around and they knock off all these kind of like lame early 60s, late 50s bands.
Let's do
And
up.
then you know, the hippies come in and change everything. And then punk rock knocks out disco and then knocks out classic rock too, right?
Mm,
And so and then Nirvana, of course, you know, gets rid of the this kind of post Van Halen establishment, which was hair metal, right?
okay.
So and I think that just happens every few years. That's basically the cycles of music. The record industries find a formula that works and then they beat it to death, and then everyone's sick of it, and it turns into something new. Now, like I said, hardcore is the exception to the rule because it never was big. It never was like a stadium music.
No,
Yeah.
no, but it has that what I've tried to do. A production director told me so many years ago. It's kind of just carving your niche in the world,
Mhm.
and you
Yeah.
get your fan base with that, and you can make it's the success without maybe the financial success, and that's why so many of these hardcore bands could still play sold out shows. They're not playing the Garden, it's Madison Square Garden, but they're playing their clubs and doing what they've been doing just like us
Yeah.
since our 20s and enjoying life. And I think that's what it's all about. So I congratulations. So again, the American Hardcore Film is in its second edition, 15th anniversary, second edition of the American Hair Metal book, and again the upcoming trilogy, the finale, when rock met hip hop. So what's the best way to keep track of everything, Stephen Blush? And I know you're doing some screenings with Q&As. So
Yeah.
if people want to see you out on the road, how can we get more info?
You could check me out, the Stephen Blush on Instagram, and Stephen Blush and Stephen Blush on um, Facebook, and stephenblush.com.
All right, that works.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming you would have mentioned because I, the hip hop thing, the first thing that came to my mind, I don't know if we'll ever get the story behind it, but did Axl Rose ever do a rap with Shaquille O'Neal? I don't think that story's true. I think Shaq has denied it. You remember that rumor that was around?
Yeah, I do remember that. I do remember that. I don't think that ever happened.
I don't think it did either, but it's fun to think about because there's also there were rumors about what they did with NWA. Did that
Hmm.
work? Did they try to tour together? So I think there's a lot to uncover. So maybe There'll be a sequel to your hip hop book. I'm going to ask you. I have some requests. See if you
Okay.
can uncover some Guns N' Roses hip hop connections. What did Axl really try to get done? What was My World really about? Was it
You know,
rapping?
there was this thing with NWA. Actually, I'm wearing my Straight Outta Cookies t-shirt.
That worked perfectly because I was
Yeah.
like, I was about to mention you have a great Cookie Monster shirt on.
Yeah.
What is that about? So perfect. It's a
Yeah.
straight out of Cookie.
So, but there is a story about NWA when Eazy-E was alive. They tried to do this thing called ghetto metal.
Mm,
You know, they saw it as a vision, but uh, you know, the guys, the surviving members, you know, were like a little too afraid to go there.
mm.
You know, they were, you know, as hip hop artists, they felt like that they couldn't really do that. But if Eazy-E had survived, I think you would have seen that.
What could have been? I mean, there's
Yeah.
photos of him and Slash, and
Yeah.
man, that collaboration would have happened.
Yeah, of course. It would have happened.
So, Stephen, thank you so much for your time, and I hope we get to do this again.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure and respect to you and appetite for distortion.
I appreciate it. And who is a better record this year, Jets or Giants? Both of our teams are not doing
Giants are gonna have a better record.
okay. I'm not gonna argue, sure.
Yeah, you know, I wrote for the Jets for 6 years.
Oh, I'm
And yeah, I
sorry.
didn't even get to talk about that, but I got really bored of writing the same version of the same article every single week. And that was a really bad time too. So
You know what?
there are some positive things happening with Aaron Glenn as the new coach
Mm.
and all that, but I'm not going to get my hopes up too high.
I'll say this to you too, because I think since you're a sports guy,
Oh,
you appreciate.
can I just say one thing is that
Oh yeah,
I
please.
became a Jets fan because I had been going to see bands like Slayer and Megadeth and Marilyn Manson and Metallica, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I went to a Jets game in the mid 90s and the crowds were worse at the Jet game. They were more misbehaved. They were more rowdy.
That's
So
funny.
that's how I really got into it because I'm from Jersey and that's where the Giants originally come from. So
Right.
that's where my allegiances started. And then for a while I wasn't even following football.
Oh, you're like, this is the
And
hardcore show just without the music.
yeah, exactly. Totally is.
I don't know if you follow basketball at all, but I just have to make this analogy before we get out of here because I see it all the time. I'm wearing my Knicks hat,
Oh, nice.
and you see all the dialogue now because they fired their coach and had been successful, and I see all these comments on Twitter about what is this management doing? They don't know how to communicate. We're never going to be successful as long as we have. It's so frustrating. And I'm just thinking, I'm a Guns N' Roses fan.
Yeah.
And a Knicks fan and an
Yeah.
Islanders fan. I'm just
Yeah.
glad I've seen some Giants wins in my life and the Yankees. Whatever. Anyway, again, we can be here for more hours. We're not going to do that. So, Stephen, thank you for your time. That does it for this episode of Appetite for Distortion. When we see the next one, in the words of Axl Rose concerning Chinese democracy, I don't know if soon is the word, but you'll see it.
Thanks to the lame ass security, I'm going home.